This video is meant to answer the question, where do I start? So I'm interested in happiness or studying happiness or even becoming happier. And it's like, that's such a big, broad thing. Like, where do I even begin? And now maybe it's kind of ridiculous that I even suggest that we're going to completely tackle that question. But I do think that with what I'm about to share in this video, with a little bit of the kind of researchy science background, but then the application can actually start to answer that question of like, where do I begin? I want to become happier or be happier. Where do I start? So that's what we're going to cover. Now, what the key thing you have to understand here is, like, I could spend hours and a whole book's worth, and I have written books on like all of what makes for happiness, like where it comes from, how to cultivate it, how to increase it, all the studies. But I believe it begins with a foundational principle, and that is called self-efficacy. Now, self-efficacy is a psychological principle that basically means your capacity to follow through on the commitments that you make, particularly to yourself. And this has also been called the G.I. Joe fallacy. Now, that comes from Laurie Santos, who is a professor and researcher at Yale. She teaches the science of well-being, which is one of the most popular happiness courses in the entire world. It's got millions of students in the online version. And she says G.I. Joe fallacy is this. So in the old cartoon G.I. Joe, he used to say, knowing is half the battle. And she's like, knowing is not half the battle. It's like 1% of the battle. Because if knowing were half the battle, isn't it true that we would all be millionaires, right? We'd all have six-pack abs, be living in these beautiful houses, and we would never, ever, ever get even a little bit frustrated because we would know that there's no point. Knowing is not half the battle. There's this huge gap between knowing and doing. Because think about it right now. I mean, you probably know in any area of your life what you should be doing or how theoretically you could be even a little bit happier, right? It's like, if I read a few more books, if I spent a little less time working, and I got to the gym and drank a little less and got a little more sleep, it's like I could easily make a list of all of the things that I already know will help me to be happier. But why doesn't it happen? And I believe it is because of this principle of self-efficacy. Self-efficacy to me is the capacity to go from knowing to actually doing. So actually executing the behavioral commitment. And importantly, it is a capacity that can be trained. So kind of think about it like this, right? If I were to tell you like, hey, go bench press 200 pounds or 300 pounds. Even if you want to do it and you have every intention of doing it, at a certain point, you just don't have the physical strength or musculature to actually lift the 300 pounds. So drawing that metaphor out psychologically, I believe it's a very similar thing with behavior change. If I were to tell you, hey, go lose 40 pounds or, go start running every day or never eat any more sugar or, double your income or whatever, how do I do that? It's like asking someone to lift 300 pounds. So the idea of self-efficacy and developing that capacity is to start with small incremental things that train your own capacity for following through on the commitments you make. And now, hopefully this video doesn't sound like I'm criticizing you or expect that you're the type of person that, is struggling and can't get anything done or whatever. Simply saying that for pretty much everyone, right? Every year, millions of people set New Year's resolutions, and then what? By the end of January, the third week of January, what happened? Right? So self-efficacy, I believe, is that missing link. And now, what we have to understand is this relates to the neuroscience of how the brain adapts and how we learn. And so in a wonderful paper, I'll reference it down below, neuroscientist Richie Davidson talks about the plasticity of well-being. And another way of saying that is that well-being, aka happiness, is plastic or pliable. In other words, it can be molded or developed. And he talks about in there this distinction of two types of learning. So you have declarative learning, which is kind of like acquiring knowledge. And then you have procedural learning, which is actually putting it into practice. So declarative learning would be like if I read a book on an article on 3 ways to be more kind in my interactions with people. It's like, great, I acquired some external knowledge and it's in here. Procedural learning would be to actually then in my conversations with my friends or with strangers or with coworkers, apply those principles and actually feel emotionally and like physiologically those differences in terms of like the kindness of the interaction and put the skills into practice. And so what really matters when it comes to learning, and particularly in this context, remember we said learning how to increase happiness or well-being, is procedural learning. But we're going to hit on both. So the idea here is if you can take this declarative learning, remember, which is acquiring the knowledge, so you kind of understand some of the causes and conditions that support happiness, and then you actually put those into practice and start cultivating them, that's the procedural learning, then you will be happier. It's kind of ridiculous, but I think it is quite literally that simple. And again, I think there's some pretty solid scientific literature that suggests this, that if you study the causes and conditions and then cultivate them, then you'll be happier. I sometimes call that my learned happiness model, but that whole thing's for another video. But we can just agree on that, right? That we can get this declarative acquisition of knowledge and then the procedural practicing of the skills. So here is what I would suggest for you, getting back to the theme of this video of like, where do I start? Would be to pick one area of study. I want to learn a little bit more about relationships. What makes good relationships? How important are relationships? How do I get more of them? How do I get deeper ones? I want to learn a little bit about mental health. Like, what are some of the basics of mental health and things I can do to kind of do like proactive mental health maintenance? What are the basics of physical health and energy? Anything. Pick any domain that you think is relevant to your personal happiness. Start there. Okay? So you pick that. Now, what you're going to do after this video at some point in the next 2 to 3 days is spend 90 minutes maximum learning. So that is the declarative, remember, knowledge acquisition. 90 minutes, you would be amazed what you can consume and digest and take away in 90 minutes of an article, a book, YouTube videos, whatever. That one thing that you wanted to learn more about, you're going to spend 90 minutes acquiring knowledge. And now here is the key, the fundamental point. Remember to shift from the knowledge and declarative to the procedural and implementation of the behavior and development of the skill. Is coming out of that 90 minutes of learning, you're going to pick one thing. One. And I'm very particular about that because the way that our attention works, if we divide it up between many things, often it just kind of falls away. You can pick one thing for sustained focus that is meant to represent to you sort of like proof that you are following through and developing this new behavior or this new skill. So if you said, I want to learn all these things about relationships, and then I'm going to have, one mindful listening session per day, or I learned all these things about the importance of sleep, and so I'm going to set an alarm to go to bed at 9 p.m. every night. Or I learned some of the things about mental health, and I learned like a breathing technique to help me reduce anxiety. Okay, great. Whatever it is, it needs to be one tangible behavior or practice or habit, right? Something that you're actually embodying the performance of a certain skill. Ideally, it's small, and you are going to do that every day for 60 days. Every day for 60 days. So again, scale it down here. You don't have to run a marathon every day. You don't have to meditate for 2 hours every day. You don't have to have like a life-changing conversation with someone every day. But you're going to think, okay, what did I just learn? How can I kind of translate that down into one short practice that I can do every day? And you're going to do it for 60 days. Now, why am I being such a stickler here about one thing, 60 days, consistent, small? It goes back to this model of self-efficacy. I sometimes teach self-efficacy as you have to decide the type of person you want to be and then prove it to yourself with small behaviors. So every action you take, every time you complete that practice or that habit or that behavior, you're essentially giving proof or accumulating evidence that you are the type of person that can follow through on that behavior. And so what you see there is almost this cycle of you have an intention or something you want to do, you do it, that gives you proof. And once you realize that you are capable of consistently following through on the commitment made to yourself, remember, that's self-efficacy. So you're building that sort of musculature, not a scientific term in this case, but you're building that muscle, that self-efficacy muscle, which again is that capacity to follow through on the things that you said you were going to do. And so now I'm going to jump a little bit more into the neuroscience behind that. So there is this thing in the brain called the aMCC, the anterior mid-cingulate cortex, that is kind of the controlling hub for tenacity, attention, and willpower, and like the ability to stick with something and follow through consistently, excuse me. And now again, this is slightly more metaphorical, but I think it's a powerful explanation. It's somewhat similar to the body in the way that you develop it, right? So if you go lift weights and run for a few miles a day, what happens to the body is that by engaging the body in that way, you build up a certain level of capacity, right? And then as you do it consistently, you build it up, build it up, build it up. But then if you stop doing it, what happens? You don't just work out for 3 months and then you're fit forever. Your muscles and your cardiovascular system, et cetera, right? They weaken. The aMCC, it's a lot of acronyms, works in a very similar way. So if you say take a cold shower every day, you take the cold shower the first day, the second day, the third day, you can actually see this area of the brain, the aMCC, developing and getting slightly larger and developing more dense connections and firing. But then if you cease that, in this case, cold exposure, you can see the activation reducing in that area of the brain diminishing. And so very similar to how your muscles work or how you're getting in shape, so to speak, this area of the brain that is responsible for our tenacity, our willpower, and our follow-through, again, self-efficacy, going from knowing to actually doing and doing consistently. It's kind of like use it or lose it. That it's a capacity that is developed through repetition, training consistently. And so that is why I believe this is sort of a formula. Granted, it's not a magic formula or a catch-all formula. But when people say, well, where do I start? I believe it is important to start with self-efficacy, start with the aMCC. And so what you're doing here is you're picking one thing that you've learned about a little bit, again, declarative learning, and then you're making that procedural learning. But as you're doing that, what you're really strengthening is your capacity for self-efficacy so that you can then pick other areas of your life that you wish to improve upon and follow through on those commitments you made to yourself, rather than being one of these millions of people who just says, yeah, this year I'm gonna start reading more, I'm gonna get better at being focused at work, and I'm gonna lose a few pounds, and then they never open the book, they never step outside or go to the gym, and they're still on their phone all day at work. So I hope you can start to see that what I'm giving you is not like some, magical self-help formula or something, but I believe that it is a kind of like a start here that is grounded in some scientific backing when it comes to the question of, well, where do I start? How do I be happier? How do I become happier, improve my quality of life, whatever. So there you have it. Again, pick one thing, one area that you're intrinsically interested in already that's important to you. Study it for, say, 90 minutes. Convert that into one ritual or practice or skill that you want to develop every single day, and do it for 60 days, consistently focus on the one thing. And as you do that, you are increasing that capacity for self-efficacy, which is your ability to do the things you say you're going to do and cross that huge gap from knowing to actually doing. So I hope this video was helpful. You can check out this channel whenever you want, kind of these practical tools and insights to help you be happier in work and in life. I'll include some references for this video down below that speak to some of the things I touched on with the neuroscience, with self-efficacy theory. Here's a video that YouTube suggests you like, and that's all for now. So thanks for watching. This has been your happiness nerd, Jackson Kirchis, and I'll see you next time.